Did you know that Spain, the country, was locking up and detaining women for not being the right kind of woman as recently as the 1980s? I have learned so many interesting things with the research rabbit hole that I fell down so many years ago now and still find myself hurtling down. The bottom, there seems to be no bottom to this thing whatsoever. And I am learning so many interesting things because of that one initial question that I started with so many years ago, which was, why is it that this random Catholic organization called Opus Dei keeps popping up in so many places? It's kind of weird. And because of that question and trying to answer that question, I have been pulling on threads that have just been leading me to all kinds of interesting historical situations that I certainly have never heard of, and that I'm willing to bet, unless you are from this country or are interested in world history, you probably don't know anything about either. And I do not want to gatekeep any of this information because that would go against the entire ethos and everything that I am trying to do here on the Deep Dive Project. So today we are going to be learning about something that the Spanish government did that has Opus Dei footprints all over and through and around it, and that, were it not for some very public events, might have lasted a lot longer than it did. So, with all of that said, my name is Beck Griffin. This is the Deep Dive Project. It is my independent venture in citizen journalism and research. Everything that we are going to be discussing today is linked in a source document down in the description, so please have a look at that. Use it as a starting point to do your own research and start asking your own questions. Of course, everything that I am saying here is just my opinion and speculation based on the information that I am reading and the perspective that I have gained from what I have learned. So take everything with a grain of salt. I'm not your one-stop shop for any information. I just want to tell you about the situation that I learned about because I think it's significant and I think it has some present-day implications as well. So with that said, let me pull up my browser and also remind everyone that, as with most things here on the Deep Dive Project, today's video comes with a content warning because the topics that we are going to be discussing are very disturbing and will not be appropriate for all audiences, so viewer discretion is advised. Please keep your mental health forefront at all times. I'm going to start with this research compendium. It's focusing on a series of reports, and you can find this link down below. It's excellent. I won't be reading the entire thing because it is 152 pages you see here, but I will be reading a first part of the prologue and part of the introduction because I think it orients us on where we need to kind of be approaching this conversation from. So the headline here says, "The Spanish Far Right on the Global Stage, Opposition to Sexual and Reproductive Rights, Case Studies of Argentina, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Chile and Kenya." This was published October 2025 by a list of authors, Ramos et al. So the beginning of the prologue says, "Structures of Power, the Importance of Understanding the Ultra-Conservative Offensive" by Nuria Alabeo. At the heart of this report lies a solid conviction that sexual and reproductive rights are not a sectoral policy, but one of the most important pillars that defines the type of society we want to build. Much depends on the defense and expansion of these rights, women's autonomy, building towards real equality, and the potential for more robust democracies. Why? Why is it so important to shore up women's rights? Why do people want to control women's rights and what we do with our bodies and when we do it and how? Well, because nobody comes into this world but through a woman. Maybe a petri dish, but you still need some parts. Nobody comes into this world but through a woman. And to put it another way, a bit more eloquently maybe, in terms that I heard growing up, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And So I think that there is a very clear incentive and a very clear reason why authoritarian regimes would want to control women and our reproductive rights. Where these rights are consolidated, people have a greater capacity to make decisions about their own lives. Where these rights are reduced through the actions of far-right parties and ultra-conservative movements, the objective is part of a broader strategy. Their actions form part of power plays that aim to entrench certain hierarchies of gender, race, and class. When this occurs, the threats that normally loom over democracy, which is always unstable, deepen still further. Given this context, it is clear why this research was so necessary and so urgent. Today, we are witnessing an organized transnational offensive based on material factors, the result of the latent crisis of liberal democracies and their economic system. I have oft remarked on what I see as sort of an alt-right political wave that seems to be sweeping the entire globe right now. It's not just happening in America or Latin America or Spain, it's happening around the globe. All of this material and symbolic instability is being culturally codified in a reactionary way. This reactionary common sense seems to be advancing everywhere, extending its reach to government positions and even winning ground in places where it does not seem to be in the majority. In places like the US, there has been significant setbacks to abortion rights, although polls consistently show majority support for pro-choice positions. And since January of this year, the Trump administration has launched a brutal offensive against so-called gender ideology, with the rights of trans people as the main target. We can learn something from the effectiveness of these strategies that overrule the will of the majority. The ultra-conservative ecosystem has managed to put together a significant political arsenal, especially in the 40 years following the revolutionary wave of 1968. However, as this report shows, the ultra-conservative right wing uses tools and organizations that have a century of history, as is the case of Opus Dei. Analyzing these cases allows us to understand some of the keys to their success. This includes their ability to bring together different forces, their perseverance, their ability to establish alliances with economic and political powers, and their capacity to train the national elite. But they are also flexible and adept at translating the core elements of mobilization to each local context, all while maintaining a coherent core that enables international engagement. They use concepts that are decades in the making, that have become from thousand-year-old institutions such as the Catholic Church, and manage to publicize them through cutting-edge communication techniques or even through street activism that was once the domain of the left. To understand how the right wing operates in practical terms, the report analyzes several national arenas: Spain, Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Kenya. It follows that ultra-conservative political capacity also relates to the ability of the right wing to move between different social contexts: academia, politics, the judicial system, religion, and the streets, turning each individual battle into an opportunity to move toward reshaping the hegemony, or in their words, waging the culture war. Thanks to this study, we have discovered a clear pattern that has developed over the last decade and a half, they say 2010 to 2025. Certain actors introduce anti-gender arguments into local legal and cultural contexts. They weave alliances with political, media, and religious elites, and they exploit online platforms to spread disinformation, trigger moral panic, and channel public conversation. These are some of the keys to their success. Another key aspect that contributes to the high impact capacity of the right wing is its interconnected international scope, which serves to enhance the capacity of each local actor. Of course, the power structure does not operate in a vacuum. It finds pressure points in institutional and economic crises, in extreme social inequality, and even in structures that represent the vestiges of the colonial era. For example, as explained in this research in Latin America, this framework is usually articulated through a colonial power structure that invokes Hispanic heritage and Spain's civilizing guardianship. Both in Latin America and in Africa, the existing cracks in the social and institutional fabric have exacerbated the impact of ultra-conservative actions. The consequences are clear: setbacks in law, administrative blockades, and the erosion of rights and the gradual deterioration of the movements that sustain them. The findings in this research provide concrete evidence to something we knew intuitively. If the playing field is international, then Spain has become a strategic hub within it. The country has managed to play a pivotal role between Europe and Latin America and has even expanded to reach Africa more recently. Spain's role has not come from a historical vacuum. The narratives about Hispanic identity, which is supposed to operate on a cultural and even moral level, are actually based on a power structure that are rooted in the colonial period and in the systemic influence that various institutional actors have since consolidated to preserve and expand their neo-colonial interests. Contemporary ultra-conservative networks have been able to identify and expand upon these pre-existing institutional structures, turning historical dependency into a strategic advantage. In this context, some of the Spanish organizations analyzed in this study provide the key to understanding how this influence is structured. 5 Spanish actors are placed under scrutiny. One of these 5 that they mention is Opus Dei, each playing their own role. Opus Dei provided the elite with a trajectory, an education system, and social network, all with the capacity for doctrinal and legal influence. Despite all of this, understanding the power of the far right cannot leave us defenseless. The report documents means of resistance that have a real impact and that open up opportunities. The mass movements in Spain against regressive reforms of abortion laws, the judicial rulings in Mexico and Colombia, the daily defense of comprehensive sexual education, the work of feminist advocates, cultural campaigns, and alliances between movements all show that it is possible, even in the midst of this right-wing offensive, to contain setbacks and move forward. Analyses like this can be turned into plans for a coordinated response and form part of the strategic intelligence necessary for those who want to defend the expansion of rights and social justice. The key to success against what may seem like an inevitable victory lies simply in taking back the organizational advantage and hard-fought accumulation of power. There is no iron law here. We must provide responses that can sustain hope, the certainty that there is much to be gained and that it is possible to achieve it, and build the necessary political capacity. Well, I have chills. Power to the people. And I do believe that there is still power in the people as well. And I, for one, stand with the people of the world. Every one of us who is forced to live here in the conditions that have been created. In short, this analysis aims to understand in order to regain the initiative. Spain is highlighted as a key club in the transnational framework that influences Latin America and Africa today. Meanwhile, this study breaks down the tactics and structures that sustain the right-wing offensive while showing that resistance exists and delivers results. The next step is clear: to organize better, increase alliances, and protect those who aim to expand and defend sexual and reproductive rights. Do not give up the ship. The fight is not over. These losers have not won nearly as much as they think that they have. People like Leonard Leo and Kevin Roberts may be resting on their laurels, but the fight is far from over as far as I am concerned. And it's good to know that I'm not the only one who feels that way. So the next part of this that I'm going to read is from the introduction, because I'm not going to read this entire thing, of course, but I think that this is an important inclusion as well, so that, again, we can orient to the conversation that we're having here today. This says, from fundamentalism to the culture war. The Spanish far-right forces that serve as a starting point for this study have origins as old as their counterparts in Western Europe, but just like in Portugal, Spain did not undergo the so-called post-fascist era that followed the Second War. The regime established by Franco in the late 1930s lasted well beyond 1945. Spain only began its democratic transition in 1978, which is interesting and important to bear in mind. Democracy is still quite young for countries like Spain. So in regard to Opus Dei specifically, they write, Opus Dei was founded in 1928 by Jose Maria Escrivá de Balaguer with a mission of evangelization based on his personal vision of Catholicism. In dialogue with the fundamentalist movement that emerged in reaction to Pope Leo XIII's reforms in the encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891, the organization responded in the 1960s with similar tenacity to the definitions of the Second Vatican Council. So we are talking about sort of an old world vanguard that does not want to change with the times, even though the Catholic Church and religious institutions around the world have been evolving since the beginning of time. But there are those who would wish to believe that that is not the case and are convicted in ensuring that it is not the case. From the very start, Opus Dei is focused on recruiting elites. The work, as it is known, avoids expressing political opinions, but has a political voice through its members, academics, liberal professionals, lawyers, jurists, and doctors. This opaque means of doing politics has given rise to fanciful narratives, which have even categorized it as a sect. In 1947, Opus Dei was recognized by the Vatican as a secular institute, which allowed it to form its own clerical body and expand its recruitment network, although the Vatican also subordinated the work to the power and rules of Rome. In 1981, John Paul II granted the work the privileged status of personal prelature, a level of independence that was diminished by Pope Francis in 2022, following allegations of abuse filed with the Vatican by a group of Argentine women. And that is, of course, referring to the case of 44 identified former domestic workers of Opus Dei in the country of Argentina who are accusing the organization of essentially labor trafficking and coercion. And the case is still ongoing and has been picked up by Argentine federal authorities. Opus Dei collaborated with the Franco regime, gaining important political and economic benefits. It was during that first period of the Franco dictatorship that the expansion of Opus Dei began. From 1948 onwards, the voyage undertaken by 3 scouts, the so-called Tres Ojeadores, to the United States, Canada, Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Argentina, financed by the Hispanic Institute of Culture, linked to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, paved the way for the establishment of Opus Dei beyond Spanish borders. So it is simply a fact, a matter of historical fact for the organization of Opus Dei, that its success globally has been facilitated in no small part by members who happen to find themselves in very influential or powerful positions of state, for example, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, paving the way, opening doors, providing funding. This has all been expounded upon in Gareth Gore's book Opus, which you should read. The other entities that make up the anti-gender group under analysis share common ground with Opus Dei, but represent political groups typical of the new context of the culture war. These organizations must be understood as the product of a long process of restructuring of ultra-conservatism and far-right policies. So the 2 organizations that they mention here in concurrence with Opus Dei, and I will just read this next part right here because it serves to illustrate a point that I'm always trying to make. They're talking about this Hazte Or and Citizen Go organizations. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but they say that the emergence of this Hazte Or in 01 was the first sign that the Spanish far right was bringing itself up to date. The far right was no longer concentrated exclusively to one party, but was spread across 2 fronts. On the one hand, the most radical wing of the Popular Party, and on the other hand, it was beginning to take shape outside the party. As Joseba Garcia Martin and Ignacia Paragoria point out, during its first decade of its existence, Hazte Or acted under the umbrella of the Foro Español de la Familia, or FEF, a platform linked to Opus Dei and other ultra-Catholic sectors. It's important to highlight that, even at that stage, the forces opposing sexual and reproductive rights were molded around the idea of an active Catholic citizenship entrusted with defending its values as established in a Vatican document published in 2002. So I am constantly, I feel, attempting to remind everybody that Opus Dei does not operate in a vacuum. Opus Dei is not the only or the largest or even the most powerful organization that is moving and doing the kinds of things that Opus Dei is doing. There are many. And it has seemed to me that over the course of this organization's history, and around the world, it has had no problem sort of linking arms and coming into ideological alignment with a variety of social, religious, and political players when it has been beneficial to their own agenda. And this is something that I've talked about quite a bit because I feel like there are numerous historical examples, and the fact that we have one very specific organization, this Hazte Or, which again I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, linked to a platform that was also linked to Opus Dei is just proof positive of the thing that I am talking about all of the time, and also points to the existence of this incredibly interconnected web, this conduit, this network, if you will, of people and players who are kind of all in the same ideological pool, if you will. And it is incredibly interesting when you start to tease everything apart and look at it all. And the other part of this as well, which is just very unfortunate, but simply a matter of fact, is that what they are describing here, these historical events, and what we are going to be talking about in this video, do nothing to paint the Catholic Church in a positive or good light. And yes, the Catholic Church has gone to many, many efforts in recent history to begin redressing wrongs and to try to make amends and to make a better way forward. And I think that is good and necessary and has to happen. But also, it is hard to be trusting of a religious organization, any religious organization. I would say the same thing of like the Mormon Church, for example. Hard to trust an organization that has so much power and so much money and so much influence and has been connected to so much terribleness. I mean, this is just scratching the surface of the terribleness. And it's like, if not fascist, why fascist shaped throughout the course of history? It's very unfortunate. So that is what I am going to read out of this very lengthy, in-depth, and incredibly educational series of reports. Please have a look at it if you are at all interested, because it has some really good information that's important. But I want to move on to the thing that is our topic of conversation here today, what I initially led with, which is the fact that there was this, well, I'll just tell you. In Spain, there was this Board for the Protection of Women that came up after Franco, during Franco's regime, and stayed around after he passed, as you are going to see, that sought to control women and control women's reproductive rights and even control the product of their reproductive organs, their offspring. And what I'm going to be getting into is abhorrent, disgusting, and infuriating on every single level. So the headline here, this is from El País. This was published on January 19th, 2024. The headline says, "The women who broke the silence about the terrifying organization that trapped and abused them during Spain's dictatorship." The Board for the Protection of Women was created during Francisco Franco's regime with the objective of redeeming immoral women. Through podcasts, books, and roundtables, abuses and violations of human rights that took place within this repressive system are finally being documented. And of course, none of these women asked to be redeemed. Immaculata Valderrama was 15 years old. This little girl was 15 years old when she died. Supposedly, she fell from a window on the third floor of a female reformatory in San Fernando de Henares, a suburb of Madrid. According to the official version of events, she was trying to escape from the facility. 15-year-old little girl. However, Immaculata was in her underwear, and the doors of the center at that moment were already open. That same day, a demonstration was organized in the municipality, blaming those in charge of the reform school, all of them evangelizing Catholics for the young woman's death. It was September 19th, 1983. And I really absolutely do love how the Spanish will take to the streets, gather and protest en masse anytime they feel like they need to. And they are quite productive with it too. Frankly, I think the United States could learn something. Although General Francisco Franco had died 8 years earlier, the longest-running and most misogynistic institution of his dictatorship had survived him. The Board for the Protection of Women. Isn't that nice? This organism, as fearsome as it was unknown, formed part of the mechanism of a system of social control which focused on the disciplining the bodies and minds of women. Why? You control women, you control the world. It was designed and applied by the Catholic Church. Isn't that nice? And the hierarchs of the regime. To do so, they relied on historical models such as the Royal Board of Trustees for the Repression of White Slavery. If not authoritarian, why authoritarian shaped? Paradoxically, the Board for the Protection of Women was created during the Second Spanish Republic with a completely different purpose. The name was appropriated following the nationalist rise to power. Franco's regime subverted it, essentially turning it into a patriarchal prison network. Within this system, members of the Catholic Church were given police functions. And it seems to me that some of the members of the Catholic Church really want those functions back. If you behave badly, they'll take you to the nuns. This was the threat that was made to thousands of women on a daily basis throughout the 36-year-long fascist dictatorship. That is longer than I have been alive. A large majority of them didn't know what exactly the threat was referring to. The much feared nuns, convents, or residences, of course, because it is so much easier to exert control over a group of people if the threat and the danger is existential and not clearly defined. The Board for the Protection of Women was created in 1941 with the objective of redeeming fallen women and helping those who were in danger of falling. Fallen women. Fallen from what? What abyss were they descending into? Was it a fall from heaven to hell? Surely no one would have been able to answer which place was the one from which apparently one woman fell. And not woman, she was a 15-year-old child in the 1980s when she fell 3 stories in her underwear from a facility left over from Franco's Spain that was being facilitated and managed by the Catholic Church. But what anyone would have been clear about both then and now is that this concept referred indisputably to women engaging in prostitution, or simply women who took control of their sexuality, of course. They'll say it's for the prostitutes, the lowest of the low, right? No one has any respect for them. But really, it's for everyone. And it's for anyone and everyone. And especially those who support it. They will come for you last. This second type of fall was extremely broad. It ranged from those who smoked to those who went to protests, making your voice heard. Remember what I said a minute ago about how Spanish people are really great about organizing a protest? They've had to overcome a lot to be able to do that. It included women and girls who were disobedient, or worst of all, who became pregnant out of wedlock, of course, because there's nothing more scandalous, right? I mean, we have this entire thing being facilitated by a fascist government and an organization with a 2,000-year paper trail of child abuse, but it's the unwed mothers that are really bringing this whole thing down. Yeah. Any female in this situation was perceived by the government and religious authorities as deserving lifelong social punishment. Under Franco, they would be forced to give up their child for adoption. Many infants were often sold. And yes, I know about Spain's stolen children. I don't know that there's a country in the world that doesn't have stolen children. And that's another rabbit hole that I would like to get down into, because I've got a bone to pick with a very popular conspiracy theory about children and cabbage patches. And I got a bone to pick with it because it's detracting from very real and known and important history. But that is a rabbit hole for another time. Let me know if you're interested in me dismantling that. Carmen Guillen, a Spanish historian, wrote a thesis about the Board for the Protection of Women. She describes how this system of control, social control, was essential to ensuring the stability of the dictatorship, since the woman was in charge of transmitting values to her offspring and consequently their indoctrination. Controlling women was a priority. It's a priority now. The death of Immaculada Valderrama in 1983 marked a before and after in the survival for the Board of the Protection of Women. Just 2 years later, it was extinguished like any other leftover Francoist institution, albeit without any reparations for the victims. And isn't that a tale as old as time? The majority of religious orders that carried out the confinement of thousands of women, none of them were convicted of any crime, continue to be involved in the field of social services. I'd like to see a list of which exactly social religious orders those are. Even Spain's democratic memory law, which came into effect in 2022, doesn't consider the female inmates as victims of the dictatorship. Women's pain is simply not taken as seriously, is it? However, a few women born after this system disappeared are bringing its cruel history to the surface while recovering the memories of its survivors. Since last year, in fact, we've witnessed an outbreak of women breaking their silence via books, articles, roundtables, and podcasts on the subject. Because, of course, that is at this point the only way that anything is going to change, because the victim survivors, those still living, are probably just trying to enjoy the shreds of the life that they have left, dealing with immense trauma left over. They can't take on something like this and demand accountability not only of their government, but of one of the most powerful religious organizations in the world. They can't do that. So it's up to other people to come in and put the pieces together and figure out what we're going to do about this entire mess. I've heard people like that kind of affectionately referred to as apocalypse librarians, because they come in the aftermath and they sift through the ashes and the debris to reconstruct the historical record for everyone else. And I kind of like that a lot. On November 9th, 1977, in Bazari prison, Maria Isabel died of shock due to burns. The prostitutes who worked in that area, her colleagues, didn't believe the official version of events and called for something like a strike. The feminist movement demanded that the crimes that only applied to women and the feminist movement be repealed. LGBTQ movements requested the abolition of the law of danger and social rehabilitation, which criminalized homosexuality. So this was in the 1970s. 43 years after her death, from my house, less than 1,000 feet from the last residence where she was registered, I tried to reconstruct the life of a lady who always fought not to be killed. Someone once told me that people like that leave no trace. Now I know that they were absolutely wrong. And they are so wrong. The traces are always there. The historical record is always there. Whether or not anyone takes the time to give it its due diligence and to go through and regurgitate that information in a way that is consumable by the public doesn't mean that it isn't there. And that is something that I have continued to be amazed by. I don't know why I should be, because I've been doing this for a number of years now, but it never ceases to amaze me. The information that you can access, that you can find just by doing a little bit of legwork, especially with the internet. The internet makes it laughable. It is laughably easy to learn this information, to start putting together the histories and the stories of people who we've been told to completely forget about because they allegedly did not matter, or, they did not matter to this particular regime, despite the fact that all human beings have inherent dignity and inalienable rights that should be protected and upheld at all times. And it's disgusting to me the lengths that people will go to, and the ways that people will become convinced of doing absolutely horrible things to each other when they're able to switch off the part of their brain that sees that other person as one of their own kind. It's a facet of human psychology that is endlessly fascinating and horrifying to me in equal measure. In 2022, Andrea I'm going to struggle with his last name, Moy Matillo, 35, published the story of Maria Isabel Gutierrez Velasco under the title Lunatica. Moy Matillo is a journalist who researched the story of this woman who lived on the margins of society, pushed thereby mechanisms of patriarchal regression that flourished during the dictatorship. Others have also engaged in this research. Erica Santillan, after reading Lunatica 2 years ago, wrote this message on Twitter, quote, "Thank you for bringing me closer to an unknown world, but above all, thank you for bringing me closer to my grandmother." Neither of them could imagine that this would be the beginning of a friendship that would lead them to join Isabel Cadenas Canyon to turn the search for Lolly, Erica's grandmother, into a podcast under the title Lunatics. Moy Mateo's book jogged Erica's memory. Thanks to the story, she recalled an unfinished conversation from decades ago in which her mother told her that her grandmother didn't have a national ID card because she was wanted by the state. Isabel Cadenas Canyon 42 has spent years reflecting on the different material elements that the expression of memory acquires. Her doctoral thesis was titled Poetics of Absence, Subversive Forms of Memory and Contemporary Visual Culture. Her interest has led her to create one of the best rated podcasts in Spain called We Don't Talk About That. In it, she weaves together episodes about recent and not so recent history. She has dedicated 2 episodes to 2 survivors of the Board for the Protection of Women, showing how the institution managed to survive for 10 years after the return to democracy. In the episode Lost, she has structured it as if it were an old cassette tape. Side A is the story of Consuelo Garcia del Cid, which takes place during the Franco regime, while side B is that of Dolores following the return to democracy. Quote, I'll make sure everyone knows what they've done to us in here. This was the promise that Consuelo made to her classmates at her reformatory, Adoratrices de Madrid, located at 52 Padre Damian Street, as she said goodbye after 2 years of being locked up without having committed any crime. She broke the silence on the reformatories a little less than 20 years ago. As the voice of Isabel Cadenas tells us, it was initially difficult for Consuelo to research this institution because she came across, in her own words, a lack of documents and an information gap. But that didn't stop her. She needed to fulfill the promise that she had made in her adolescence. So she started looking for her former prison companions, interviewing them and asking for documentation. Then she recounted her experiences and the fruits of her research on televisions. Thanks to her appearances, new testimonies began to emerge. Consuelo dedicated herself to putting everything in writing in The Banished Daughters of Eve, The Insurgents of the Board for the Protection of Women, and Pray for Us are some of the works that have served as an obligatory reference for Spanish researchers delving into this topic. In her own words, democracy forgot about us, and that was an atrocity committed against minors who, in addition to other punishments and labor, were even made to undergo virginity tests, which is complete bullshit, fake pseudo-science attempting to justify a social cultural construct, which is literally all that virginity is. How absolutely disgusting. And it's no use telling me that's just how Spain was. That prison system for minors was an unquestionable atrocity. Yes, we need to stop just saying, well, that's just the way it was back then. Well, that was their culture. Well, that was just the way they did things. No. Wrong is wrong and is wrong, and 2 wrongs don't make a right. And even doing something for what you think is a good reason does not necessarily make the thing that you are doing good too. And I really think that we need to dispense with the whole cultural and historical defense. Some cultures have practices and beliefs that are abhorrent and disgusting and need to go the way of the dodo bird and deserve, in my opinion, to be shamed publicly. Doesn't mean I don't respect that culture, but cultures need to change and evolve. Wrong is wrong is wrong. 2 wrongs do not make a right. Chelo Alfonso was one of the many young pregnant women who passed through the Santo Celo Reformatory, because remember, simply being an unwed mother was enough to warrant you being completely incarcerated, deprived of your liberty. This little girl was 14 years old when she became pregnant. I wonder how she got pregnant. And when she told her aunt, the reaction was terrible. 2 men put her in a car, and she was taken to Oblate Reform School in Valencia. When she went into labor, she entered the La Cigüeña clinic under a false name. The general anesthesia prevented Chelo from remembering the slightest detail of giving birth. So she had a twilight delivery. She woke up crying and asking for her son. She never got to see the newborn. Without time to recover from the trauma, they locked her in the Doratrices de Valencia Reform School. Absolutely disgusting, absolutely abhorrent, indefensible behavior. And I think, frankly, unless it's to protect the life of a child from like a very real and like clearly identifiable harm to their like physical health and safety, not pearl clutching morality, is separating a child from their parent for any reason other than that is wrong. on every single level is just completely wrong. And the amount of trauma that creates in a person's life, especially if you're never able to connect with your roots or learn about where you came from, who contributed to you becoming the person that you are, your identity, that is tremendously important. That is an evil, in my opinion. This is just one of the many horror stories that Marta Garcia Carbonell and Maria Paulo Galdon collect in their book. These two journalists heard about the Board for the Protection of Women for the first time when they were working on a report about the women's prison at the convent of Santa Clara in Valencia. And from the moment they learned of its existence, they devoted their lives to discovering and describing the modus operandi of this prison and patriarchal framework. Just 1 year after that discovery, they obtained a major Spanish research scholarship for journalism, thanks to which they have seen the fruits of their labor published, Unworthy Daughters of Their Country. In their book, filled with maps and photographs, they also point out the spaces and religious orders that were a part of this punitive network. The leading thesis in this field of study, the patronage for the protection of women, prostitution, morality, and state intervention during the Franco regime, was published by 36-year-old historian Carmen Guillen, who analyzes the parallelism between the Catholic Nationalist Alliance in Spain and the model of social control implemented by Italian fascism. Again, if not fascist, why fascist shaped? Asylum-like centers were used not only for women with psychiatric problems, but also for those who didn't fit the stipulated feminine model. Many of these researchers have met for roundtables, some of them promoted by the Spanish Institute of Women. In these events, a survivor is always included in the audience, which is so critically important. When you're talking about situations like this, you're raising awareness about human rights atrocities. If they are recent, and there is any possibility of connecting with and supporting the actual victim survivors of that human rights atrocity, that must be done. They must be incorporated into the entire process. It's so critically important, I think, to center victim survivors because, for one thing, they're the ones who know better than anyone the actual impacts of what that experience was. Armchair, philosophers and people weighing in from the peanut gallery are never going to actually be able to speak to an experience as powerfully as the people who have been through it firsthand. So it's critically important for that reason, and also so that we can listen to people who have been through these experiences to hear what they think needs to be done to prevent it happening in the future. We can't just acknowledge that this happened and then hurry up and move on with the rest of our life. That's not working. That hasn't worked. It's never worked. And we need to start doing something significantly different in the future. In these spaces, doubts are raised about how they're transmitting this experience. Many of the women who passed through these religious centers weren't aware that they were being held by a specific institution. Fewer had even heard of the board at the time. So no criminal justice at all in any way, shape, or form. People who are incarcerated also are supposed to have rights and be entitled to information. Clearly not the case in this situation. Therefore, they fear that many other women don't recognize themselves as victims of the same organization. And it's sad to say that is probably very, very true. And also, this is a great time to mention the fact that we're talking about a situation that happened in Spain, which is a specific country, and during a very specific time. But this is not an uncommon or strange situation. This is not some evil apparition of fascism that came up that's completely antithetical to anything else that we've ever seen in human history. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Unfortunately, even for the Catholic Church, this is hardly the first time that they have been involved in moralistically determining who should and should not be allowed to live a free life. And that is something that I'm going to be getting into further in the future. So if you're not already, please consider subscribing, and I hope that you'll stick around for the conversation about organizations like this, movements like this, programs and initiatives like this that deprive people of liberty simply for not fitting the status quo. It's so incredibly dangerous. It's reprehensible, and it needs to be condemned and called out at every point. And I think it's critically important that we know about the situations in the past where this has happened, where there have been actual victims, because I don't want to live in a world where this kind of thing continues to happen. And it's sad to say, it's happening as we speak. It's happening here in this country as we speak. And it's sickening. Says, be that as it may, we're witnessing the reparative will of a generation of granddaughters, some of them biological, others metaphorical, who, being aware of the androcentric bias that prevails in historical narratives, have decided to count the women who came before them. They're sure that by doing this, they're counting themselves in the process. In Autoscience Fiction for the End of the Species, author Begonia Mendez writes, quote, "Where are the biographies of my grandmothers? What traces of my future do their existences contain? My grandmothers left me a blank piece of paper. These are the questions that are pushing us to finally break the inherited silences." So consider this video my introductory piece on the topic of the Board for the Protection of Women that was created in Franco's Spain, and that lasted far too long, and that has implicated a religious organization that I was born into and raised in, and another religious organization, Opus Dei, that I have spent a lot of time talking about. I think that this is a really important historical event that we need to draw people's attention to, because it feels very prescient for the times that we are living in. And in an interest of moving forward as more aware people, this is something that I wanted to bring up. I have more that I'm going to get into, other articles that I want to read in the future, but this is where I'm going to conclude this video for today, just to keep it short. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Please give this a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. If someone that you know or yourself are in need of mental health support, I have linked a variety of resources down in the description. Please take a look at those. I know that life is very hard, but we don't have to go at things alone or completely unequipped. There are people who want to help. So if you need help, please do reach out. Ways to connect with me and support my work across social media are also linked down below. If you have a story or a situation that you want to tell me about, something that you think deserves more attention, feel free to send it my way. You can send it to the Deep Dive Project at protonmail.com. And that is where I'm going to leave this for today. I'll have a new video for you very soon, either following up on this topic or about the litany of other important topics that I want to talk about. So I will see you very, very soon. But in the meantime, just remember, nolite te bastardes carborundorum. Don't let the bastards drag you down.